I'm wondering, do you want to lead us in a short meditation?
Oh, how
to get us
lovely.
going?
What a great thought. Would you like to sit for a few minutes? Okay, so if you want to just sit comfortably, see if your back can be straight but not like stiff or rigid. You want some energy in your body, especially this hour, but also to be relaxed and at ease, because what we do is really actually quite natural. And let your attention settle on the feeling of your breath, wherever you feel it most distinctly. The nostrils, the chest, or the abdomen, and it can be just the normal, natural breath. Sounds can come and go, images can come and go. We don't have to fight them, we don't have to follow after them. It's just one breath. And if you find you've gotten lost in thought, spun out in a fantasy, or you've fallen asleep, truly don't worry about it. We say the most important moment is the next moment, after you've been gone, after you've been lost. It's the moment of recovery that's most important. So see if you can let go gently of whatever distracts you, and with some kindness towards yourself, return your attention to the feeling of the breath. We let go and we begin again. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can't go wrong from here.
No. We always do it again.
I needed it, yeah. I always do it again. So we're going to cover, quite likely, a variety of topics. But one of the things I thought we could start with was, it didn't quite come together to me at the time, and I mentioned this last night, that we created the kind of inaugural Mindfulness in America Summit in the busiest city, I think, in the country, on the busiest street in the country, right, like next to Times Square and between Times Square and Grand Central Station. And you also choose to live here.
I know, crazy,
most of the time. So you consider yourself a New Yorker?
Yeah, well, I am a New Yorker. I grew up here, so
Okay.
It's kind of, I guess, the rhythm is in my body. And sometimes Barre, Massachusetts, where the Insight Meditation Society is incredibly peaceful, low-key kind of place. And sometimes I see people from there, and they look at me here and they say, "Are you okay here?" And I say, "It's a choice. No one's making me be here."
And it's a choice because?
I think what happened was when I came, when you were here, and it was a period of my life I was working on this book, Faith, and I was teaching, and I was meeting people who were incredibly creative, who were writers, who were artists, who were creating in some way, and it felt like a whole other part of me kind of came into being, and so it was a wonderful place for me, and I never quite left.
Got it. Beautiful, beautiful. And the part of the topic we're going to do today is look at like how we see mindfulness emerging in America, and you've been a part of this from the very early days. And so I'm curious, How do you see it evolving? And do you have concerns? Do you have hopes? What do you see now that we see mindfulness? We see mindfulness associated with spas, with apps, with
mayonnaise.
With mayonnaise. Is there mindfulness mayonnaise now?
Yeah, my mayo.
So it's going viral in many ways. How do you see it? Are you happy for this? Are you not happy for this? Do you see it as just this kind of curious show? There's even big conferences on it.
I love those conferences.
Yeah. So how do you see its growth or its evolution?
Well, I mean, I do go way back, being as old as I am. And one time I went to teach it at Google, and I was introduced as an OG. So I said, "What's that?" I didn't know what it meant, and they said, "Original gangster."
Yeah.
So. And of course, I remember the days when you never heard the word mindfulness, and meditation was a fringe activity. It was kind of woo-woo, and if you were professional in many professions and you were a meditator, you hid that fact.
Yeah.
You just did not disclose that because you would be so suspect. And so for me to see this, it's like a miracle. It really is. Wow. And every once in a while, if I run into John Kabat-Zinn somewhere and say, "What happened? What do you think happened?" I don't get it. I don't understand what happened. It can't just be the science. And he usually says, "I think it's just the science." But it's like, what happened? And of course I have concerns. I mean, it's not up to me, how it's going to unfold. But, Amishi, for example, is a friend of mine. And when I go to Miami, which is every couple of years to teach, I stay with her. And I'm an incredibly late night person, and she is not. And I know if I can get her up to like 2 a.m., she'll give in on everything we're discussing, and so by 2 a.m. she says, "You're right. Teachers do need more training than they're getting." And, maybe the widespread dissemination isn't the point.
Yeah.
Or it's not the only point. What about going deep, or fewer people going deep, which has always kind of historically been the way, and not that that's, necessarily the right way, but there's so much we don't know, and that I just treasure the fact that the discussion is happening, and hopefully without a lot of certainty or rigidity in people's points of view, because there's a lot that's not known.
Right. So one of the things we have been seeing, and I know, so Dan Harris was supposed to be actually joining us today, and he got called away on assignment internationally for ABC News, and it's kind of out of his control, so he sends his regrets. He's actually been scheduled, I think, 3 or 4 times, and I think half the time, sometimes there is something he's called away for, but he wanted to be here. And part of the discussion we wanted to have, and we had it a little bit with Andy Puddicombe, who's one of the founders of Headspace today, which has been downloaded, 21 million times or something, is that apps are now a source, and I know you're involved in Dan Harris's 10% Happier app. Apps are now a source where many people get introduced to some kind of practice. And how do you see that world? And see, if you're participating in it, you must be supportive of it. At the same time, traditionally, so much happened through transmission and through a teacher relationship and a teacher noticing where a student's at and be able to guide him or her. So it's different times. And how do you see it?
This too is like a mystery. I am part of certainly Dan's app, 10% Happier, and a little bit Insight Timer, and I think some other apps I might be on. And in some ways, I think it's just complex. I also started this conversation with John the other night. It's like there's something that technology does that's wonderful. Many things it does that's wonderful, including disseminating the voices of people who have had a lot of training or, are very steeped in the practice. So it reminds me a little bit of arguments I've had with some of my publishers when they've been about to put out audio versions of my books, especially some books that have a lot of guided meditations in them, and they like to hire actors and actresses to read the books. And I was sitting somewhere in a cafe and I got an email from this one publisher saying, "Good news, we got an audio contract." And I wrote and I said, "When do you want me to come in and read it?" And they said, "Oh, we don't want you to come in and read it. We're hiring an actress." And I said, "Well, do they know how to meditate? Where are they going to be leading that guided meditation from? From what place within themselves?" And the publisher said, well, at least let me send you a voice sample. So they sent me this voice sample, but I was in a very noisy place, so I sent it to my assistant at the time. I had a total meltdown. She said, I would return that so quick if it wasn't, so that's what John and I were talking about, was the sense of embodiment that comes through the voice, the understanding, just the years.
Yeah.
I mean, what I just led so briefly is usually a surprise to people because I emphasize that moment of coming back. Mm-hmm. And I've taught thousands of people at this point who are surprised, who start meditation thinking the goal is to keep your attention on the breath and force out all thoughts. And if you have a thought in your head, you're doing it wrong. And countless people say to me, I tried it once and I failed at it. So the only way that people who have spent a lot of time training and practicing can reach a lot of people is through technology. I would much rather see that than somebody who frankly decided they wanted to be a mindfulness teacher and printed a card, which happens.
Yeah, totally. And so how do you see, what are some of the maybe misnomers or misunderstandings you feel like as mindfulness kind of spreads that you get feedback for, or that you're maybe like going, or at least you feel
I do
like
that sometimes.
Yeah.
No, it's not that. I am so
And we have no Pope of mindfulness, I know, so there's not like a system that...
No, definitely not me. Like, don't send your complaints to me. Like, I don't know. Well, first of all, I also think we really don't know that. Sometimes I think about just almost like the pressures of history. It's like I look back at things like the Freedom Riders, and I think how brave to go out there and register people to vote in a climate of such hatred and violence and being beaten up, and they knew that's what they had to do to make the change. And then I realized one day they didn't know that it was going to make the change. They did it because it felt like the right thing to do. That we actually don't know that it's all going to work out the way we want, but we have to do what we do. And I kind of think of it almost like that, like there are things that I try to emphasize. And that's mostly what I can do is sort of, in my work, try to have a certain sense of integrity. And some of that, in terms of mindfulness, comes from, I think, a lot of the popularization, not all of it, but a lot of the popularization of mindfulness is about inhabiting our lives, like really enjoying that cup of tea, because we're not multitasking. We're just really tasting the tea. And that's fabulous, because Lord knows we don't really enjoy our lives that much. But, classically, mindfulness is not about so much inhabiting our lives, it's about understanding our lives. It's about being able to look at what arises and see, like that vengefulness, which I have thought was the answer to my feeling so weak or so put down, it's not making me stronger. Look at that. And compassion, which I've maybe been taught all my life is stupid or makes you gullible, or it's so saccharine and gooky. I'm channeling Dan Harris now, since he can't be here. It's not. So we get to look, the word naked has been used a lot here. We get to look nakedly at our experience. And we understand for ourselves the truth of what makes us happy and what really oppresses us from within. And then we see deeper truths. We see things like the truth of change, and we see the truth of interconnection. And that's what mindfulness is really designed for. So every once in a while, I wonder, what's going to happen if it, basically is announced over and over again that the purpose of it is to enjoy your cup of tea.
And in that sense, kind of have a feel-good experience that doesn't necessarily get to the root of what actually creates our suffering.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, I don't think, it's not like the fact that it's widespread doesn't make it that way.
Right.
It's just the conviction or the understanding of who's presenting it.
But it does seem that the tendency, at least in our culture in particular, is to make something as beautiful and is pretty. You're not going to say, practice this to understand your trauma and feel your deepest pain and have compassion for yourself.
Correct.
Probably not likely to go over.
No,
well.
This is America. The conference is Mindfulness in America.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, one of the funny conversations, funny to me, that I often hear is basically, what's the dose? What's the least amount of time I can put into this thing and still have my brain change? And it's usually phrased that way.
Yeah.
What's the least effort I can do every day?
How do you find yourself responding?
I laugh and I say, neuroscientists say that last thing I heard was just last week was 8 minutes a day will change your brain. But I don't know how healthy it is to go for the bare minimum. Like maybe you could beef it up a little bit.
And how do you where do you see that intention plays in that? Do you feel
Intention?
like So if my intention is to get my 8 minutes in and get my brain healthy, does that have a different intention in versus doing it for 8 minutes that as a kind of act more of a compassion for oneself or for the world or desire to heal suffering?
Well, I think that might even bring us back to one of the original questions about a teacher and the app, because people's intention usually changes in the course of doing practice. My intention certainly changed. I mean, I went to India, with a background of pretty significant suffering, and my goal was to not suffer so much. And you could have told me anything about the suffering of the world and be like, yeah, okay, fine. I didn't care at all, really. And it was only as I made a certain amount of progress that I suddenly opened up to a very different set of intentions or motivations to practice. And I think that's natural. So what if you've just got that app?
Yeah.
One of the things that teachers have always, good teachers, and that's also another question. Good teachers have played the role of really being on the side of the student. They don't teach for their own ego gratification. There's a Zen saying that the goal of every good teacher is to have students who surpass them. And yes, and we heard that with Andy, right?
Yeah.
With other people, and so. The teacher is there kind of helping you as you fall into pitfalls or and it may be that it's different now. It may be that communities will take on that role of together in some different kind of way, but there was a lot of love in those relationships, and that love is important because I think it reminded each of us of the love we're capable of. And I don't really love my iPhone in the same way, although I might once have, actually. It's just not the same thing.
Yeah. So that actually brings us to a new topic, which is, as it seems like as you've, your own life and practice has matured, you've written more and more about love and about compassion. And I'm wondering what motivated that, and do you still feel like you're teaching the same thing you've always taught, and now you're just kind of using different phrases? Or have you evolved, or do you see yourself evolving? And so why, at least from my experience of you, compassion and love are much more in your vocabulary these days than anything else, and I'm curious about that.
I'd like to think I'm evolving, but my first book, which came out 21 years ago, is called Loving Kindness. And my most recent book, which came out like 2 months ago, is called Real Love.
Okay, so maybe
maybe I'm just kind of going round and round, hopefully in a deeper level each time. And people have said to me, well, why'd you write another one? On the same topic. And in between, there was The Force of Kindness, and there was the Kindness Handbook, and there was Love Your Enemies, and there was just like, So it's been a thing in my life. I mean, from the first time I heard of Loving Kindness meditation, which was way back in January of 1971, when I started mindfulness practice, I just thought, oh, what is that? I went to Burma in 1985, and I did 3 months of intensive loving-kindness practice, and I did 4 years of loving-kindness practice subsequent to that, and it's always been like very powerful. And I came back and started teaching it in '85, and it was really the first time I think that that particular technique was being taught here, and it's always been important to me. I don't think it's absent by any means from mindfulness. I think definitely it's there, but for some people, that particular dedication. And I have changed also. It's like there are whole sections in this last book which would never have been in my first book, you know, about, I interviewed the guys from Baltimore from the Holistic Life Foundation who are doing incredible work in the inner city schools, and one of my favorite stories of all from the book is from them, where they talked about a little girl, I think 9 years old or so, who was one of their students. And they bring yoga and meditation into some really fierce schools. And she was a fighter, this little girl, and she was very poor. She was always wearing like ragged clothes, and so the kids would bully her and tease her, and she would fight and get into a lot of trouble. So one day they said they walked into like the gym or something, and she had this little kid up by the neck up against the wall. And then she said, "You're just lucky I know how to meditate." She dropped the kid and went and sat and meditated. You know, so, you know, that would not have been in love with kindness 21 years ago.
No. Yeah. And do you find that for yourself, as you kind of look out at the world and you see like the antidote to kind of the conditions that we find ourselves in, one of the things that we shared in our back and forth with the questions you had brought up was, well, is this just about a method or is this about love? And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, which was your question, and I think it was a great question, is what are we doing? Are we learning a method, is the method opening to love, or how do you see this evolution of the human heart?
It's funny, it was my question, because I don't know the answer. I mean, I think it's both. I think the method is a way to open. And even just like what we did, for example, I mentioned kindness, but I didn't have to. I could have just said, let go of whatever's distracting you and return to the breath. But you actually cannot do that method successfully without developing some self-compassion. Because the great conditioning most of us have is to see our minds have wandered and to just go into a rant.
Yeah.
You know, I'm the worst meditator that ever lived. I can't believe I'm thinking. No one else in the room is thinking, right? And on from there. And so to practice letting go and coming back, even without love never being mentioned or articulated, that's what we're deepening. You have to be. And then part of what I think I cherish myself in my own work, looking back, especially over my writing, is I think I like to take words that in my mind have gotten sort of degraded or understood differently than I understand them to be, and kind of redeem them. And like I wrote a book on faith, and even my friends were shocked, you know, like, why are you writing on that? Because for so many people that word had come to mean being silenced or not being able to ask questions, and it didn't mean that to me. And love, I think, is really, in many ways, first of all, it's overused, of course, you know, like, I love this table. It's kind of nice. And also, for many people, it does mean sentimentality or kind of passivity, like, I'll just be loving, you know, and, you know, even in the discussions that were happening earlier, where love was offered as, I think, the rightful solution to many of the problems that we face. And I would say for me too, I want love to be a part of every conversation. But many people hearing that think love means, I'll just love them, you know, and let them have their way. It's very hard to understand, and it takes a lot of personal exploration, and I think those methods actually help us explore it.
So what does love mean to you if you feel like it's...
It's funny, because for me it means connection. It means like a moment of connection. It's not necessarily the form that's going to take in one's life, or the action that will ensue, but it's like right now, you know.
Okay.
It's that moment.
And there's connection to yourself or connection to another.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if I want to cultivate that, what do I do? If I'm in the audience, like, sure, I'd like love. I'd love a little more love.
Yeah.
What is the practice?
What's the secret? The secret is the same secret. It's attention. It's how we pay attention. It's awareness. You know, like if I'm sitting here thinking, is there one more witty thing I can say? And the next, you know, there's not going to be a connection. If I'm thinking about my email, which I meant to answer, there's not going to be a connection. If I, in looking at myself, as many of us often do, say at the end of the day, almost evaluating ourselves, if I only think about the mistakes I've made and how flawed I am and how I didn't really say what I meant to say, we need to stretch, you know. We need to almost ask ourselves, anything else happened today?
Yeah.
You know, what's the good within me?
Yeah.
And there's a very, very powerful question of who we pay attention to.
Yeah.
And who we objectify, who doesn't count, who doesn't matter, not only through bias or prejudice, but just indifference.
Yeah.
You know, who have we objectified to that extent that, you know, kicking the table is one thing, kicking a human being and thinking you're kicking a table, that's a very different thing. So who do we pay attention to?
Yeah.
And that's the training, actually.
Yeah. And do you find that the most of the people who are acting out in violence, there's a lot of self-hatred that
I think so.
Have been internalized?
I think so. Somebody asked me, I was teaching somewhere, and somebody said, but they don't seem unhappy. You know, like a lot of the people who are really, you know, like we feel, you know, sure, those acts come from deep, deep pain. Because we know for ourselves it comes from pain within me. And this guy said, but they seem really content. And I said, I know, it's maddening. It's like, it'd be so much easier if they just looked a little frayed around the edges, you know, or like, but I'm sure it's true that that's where it comes from.
And how do you respond when you read the news or you see just the enormous tragedy that's going on, whether it's in Las Vegas or somewhere else? It seems to be kind of just a part of our culture now. And the fact that somebody can live so isolated and so much suffering that they inflict huge amounts. I know this is a kind of weird question to even ask you, but how do we as a society, do you feel like, respond to that? Or how do you find yourself responding to that when you're... In the years past, we weren't aware of so much tragedy. It's either more tragedies happening or we're just aware of all the tragedy more because the news systems are such that they are. Yeah. And so how do you work with bearing witness to that, whether it's directly in front of us or through a screen?
Well, a lot of people are in very deep grief over the state of the country right now. Many of us are really in perpetual outrage. And for me, it all needs to get translated into action. I think the good that we can do, the good that's in front of us that doesn't seem huge or monumental needs to be done. And we can't get so disheartened or feel so alone that we don't do that thing. And I am a giant obsessive about people voting. You know, as we work, even though, you know, there's a lot of probably rightful effort, no doubt, to move from a system which is considering power dominant over others into more of a partnership. While we live in that system, there are people I would rather not have power. You know, like people running around screaming, you know, whatever they were screaming, Jews should not replace us, or running around with Nazi flags in Charlottesville. You know, I think maybe better not, you know. And so it takes the committed participation of everybody to do that. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our time is up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.